powerful black CEO is already carrying private grief when a terrible accident leaves him trapped inside his own body, fully aware but unable to speak. While his board circles his company like vultures and greedy relatives begin planning what to take, the one person who keeps showing up with quiet dignity is a janitor raising his deaf daughter alone. The child notices what doctors miss, and her innocent trust becomes the first real bridge back to the man everyone has started treating like a ghost. As secrets gather in hospital hallways, a nurse risks everything to expose a plan that could erase him for good. What begins as silence becomes a battle over truth, loyalty, and what it means to truly hear another human being. In the end, justice comes softly but clearly, and healing begins in the one place money never could buy. Bright, more natural, less overly cinematic photoreal ad look, warm soft key plus fill, neutral film grade, readable BG 24, 35 mmF/4, 5.6 grain. The private recovery wing had gone quiet in the way expensive places often do, as if money could soften fear. Past midnight, the halls held only low-light, polished floors and the distant hum of machines doing work no human hands could finish. Elijah Turner pushed his janitor's cart slowly, one hand guiding it, the other carrying a small paper bag with crackers for his daughter. Lena walked beside him in her yellow sweater, tired but awake, watching everything. She should have passed room 407. Instead, she stopped. Inside the glass, Isaiah Cole lay still beneath white blankets, a powerful man reduced to the shape of a patient no one expected to return. The city knew his face from business magazines and charity galas. Now his body did not move at all. The chart outside his door used careful words, but the meaning was plain. Unresponsive. Severe trauma. Uncertain outcome. Lena stared through the glass and lightly touched her father's sleeve. Elijah looked down. She signed, slow from sleepiness, but clear enough. He looks lonely. Elijah glanced into the room, then back at her. His face softened. He signed back. Some lonely people are still listening, even when the room says otherwise. Inside the bed, Isaiah heard every word. He could not lift a hand, turn his head, or beg them not to leave. Lena pulled a folded drawing from her pocket and placed it on the windowsill, a garden under morning light. Isaiah had been awake since the night of the accident, not awake in any way the room respected, but awake enough to know the difference between daylight and darkness, footsteps and silence, kindness and performance. His body would not answer him. Every command he sent vanished before it reached a finger, a mouth, even his eyes. Still, his mind remained clear, trapped behind skin that had become a locked door. Doctors came in with careful voices, explaining reflexes, scans, and probabilities, as if mercy could be built from softer words. Board members came later and whispered in colder tones, already shaping the future of a company he had not agreed to leave. Family members performed grief best when visitors were present. Once the hallway cameras turned away, their worry thinned into calculation. The worst part was not pain. It was being treated like absence. Again and again, panic rose in him, hot and suffocating, until memory stepped in where movement could not. Naomi in hospice. Naomi, weak and fading, whispering through dry lips, "Stay with me." He had stayed with her then. Now her voice stayed with him. Nearly hopeless, one specialist said. Those words struck like nails driven into wood, sealing him deeper inside himself. When the room finally emptied, Isaiah fixed his attention on the child's drawing at the windowsill, a garden beyond glass, bright and alive, waiting for someone to reach it. Adrienne arrived in a cream coat that looked too elegant for a hospital, with Marcus a step behind her carrying coffee neither of them intended to drink. The moment they entered, their faces arranged themselves into sorrow. Their voices turned soft for the nurse checking monitors, full of careful concern and family devotion. Adrienne asked whether Isaiah seemed peaceful. Marcus nodded at the right moments, playing the part of a worried nephew. Then the nurse stepped out. The room changed. Adrienne lowered her voice first. The estate papers need reviewing before the press starts asking harder questions. Marcus glanced at Isaiah's still body. And if he never really comes back? She did not answer at once, which told Isaiah more than words. Then she said, "We prepare," quietly, cleanly. Before the board makes its own move, their grief was polished. Their hunger was not. Isaiah lay frozen, listening as his own blood discussed his absence like a vacancy in a building they planned to fill. Media timing, trustees, temporary guardianship, the house, the company apartment, even Amara's future, spoken of as a detail to be managed, not a child to be loved. On her way out, Adrienne noticed the drawing on the windowsill and flicked it aside with 2 fingers. What is this clutter? Much later, the night nurse returned, picked it up, smoothed the bent edge, and set the little garden back where Isaiah could see it. Before the accident, Isaiah Cole moved through the city like a man people trusted without needing to announce it. He was wealthy, yes, but wealth was never the first thing people said about him. They spoke of steadiness, of discipline, of the way he built his company without treating workers like numbers to be cut loose the moment profit lines narrowed. When other executives talked about trimming human cost, Isaiah asked what kind of success required breaking the people who earned it. He carried himself with calm authority, shoulders straight, voice measured, eyes attentive. But in the year after Naomi's death, something in him had gone quieter. Not weaker, just quieter. Grief had sanded down the parts of him that once filled a room easily. At home, his real work began. Amara was 12 now, bright and observant, and after a severe illness she had lost most of her hearing. Isaiah refused to let silence become distance between them. So each night, after board packets and legal calls and unread messages piled up around him, he sat at the kitchen table and practiced sign language. Some motions came awkwardly, some he repeated until his hands ached. Amara corrected him with patient little smiles. The board admired his results, but not his restraint. Compassion slowed, ruthless expansion. From the outside, Isaiah's life looked polished. In truth, each day was a careful balance of leadership, fatherhood, and private mourning. In the quiet hours of the hospital, Isaiah's mind often drifted back to Naomi's final weeks in hospice, when time had slowed and every ordinary gesture had begun to carry the weight of farewell. She had always been the emotional centre of their home, the one who made wealth feel ordinary and kindness feel necessary. Around her, success never felt loud, it felt useful. Even when pain weakened her voice, Naomi still watched the people she loved more closely than she watched herself. What frightened her was not death. It was the thought of Isaiah surviving her by becoming harder, colder, less reachable. She knew grief could turn a strong man into a sealed room. One evening, with Amara asleep in a chair by the window, Naomi touched Isaiah's hand and told him something he never forgot. Being heard, she said, was a form of love, not just answered, not fixed, not rescued, heard. She asked him to stay open, especially for their daughter, who was already struggling with hearing loss and the quiet loneliness that came with it. She told him Amara would need patience more than protection, tenderness more than perfection. Isaiah promised her then, with tears he did not hide, that he would never let their daughter feel alone inside silence. After Naomi was gone, that promise shaped every choice he made. The meeting began at 4 and went cold before it ended. Around the long glass table, the board spoke in the polished language of efficiency, but Isaiah heard the truth underneath it. They wanted layoffs hidden inside restructuring. They wanted to strip worker protections, sell off smaller divisions, and call the damage necessary discipline. Numbers were projected onto screens as if numbers could explain away families. Isaiah sat at the head of the table, calm but unmoving. Short-term spikes are not health, he said. If we gut the people who built this company, we are not saving it. We are hollowing it out. A few members looked away. They knew he was right. Victor Dane did not. Or perhaps he did and simply did not care. He leaned back, hands folded, speaking in the smooth tone he used when dressing appetite as strategy. He called Isaiah sentimental. Not directly, of course. He used words like agility, transition, shareholder confidence. But the contempt beneath them was plain, and so was the ambition. Victor was not planning for recovery. He was studying succession. When the meeting finally broke, Isaiah walked out carrying the ache of restraint in his chest. Then his phone buzzed. It was a video from Amara. She stood in the kitchen at home, concentrating hard as she signed a new phrase for him, slow and careful, waiting to see if he would understand. Isaiah watched it twice in the hallway and smiled for the first time all day. Then he stepped into the rain, into headlights smeared across wet streets, into the long drive home. The crash came fast, a burst of light, a horn, metal turning the world sideways. Then nothing he could hold. By the time most people noticed the hospital had gone quiet, Elijah Turner was already deep into the part of the night that belonged to workers no one remembered in daylight. He cleaned slowly and well, never cutting corners, never asking to be seen. Since his wife died 3 years earlier, night shifts had become the shape of his survival. When childcare fell through, Lena came with him, carrying crayons, books, and patience no child should have needed so young. Before life narrowed, Elijah had wanted to become an interpreter. He had loved the precision of sign, the way feeling could live in the hands without losing truth. But rent, grief, and hospital bills had changed the path. Still, he never let the language go. Lena had been born deaf, and in their home signing was not a skill. It was love made visible. That was why Elijah noticed things others missed. A change in monitor rhythm. A flicker in Isaiah Cole's eyes when voices entered the room. The tension that gathered in one still hand whenever family members spoke too freely beside the bed. Elijah did not believe every quiet room held a miracle. Life had taught him better than that, but he also refused to treat a man like furniture just because the world found silence easier than simply patience, that it happened after midnight, after Adrienne and Marcus had left behind another trail of careful voices and ugly meaning. They had stood near the bed, talking about Isaiah, as if he were already a room being emptied. By the time the hallway settled again, tears had gathered silently at the corners of his eyes, the only betrayal his body would allow. Elijah noticed. He looked once through the glass, then stepped inside and closed the door behind him. For a moment he said nothing. He simply moved to where Isaiah could see him clearly, not as a janitor passing through, but as one human being choosing to stay. When Elijah spoke, he signed at the same time, his hands steady and deliberate. "I do not know what you can understand," he said softly. "Maybe all of this reaches you. Maybe only some of it does. But no one should stand over a living man and lie as if he is already gone." Isaiah stared at him, unable to blink away the tears, unable to nod, unable to beg him to keep talking. Elijah's face gentled. "You are not alone." The words settled into the room with more force than any speech Isaiah had heard since the crash. He still could not move. He still could not answer. But something inside him, stretched thin by fear and humiliation, finally stopped slipping. "You are not alone." The phrase stayed with him after Elijah left, quiet and steady, like a hand on the shoulder in the dark Amara came on a grey afternoon with Aunt Rochelle, who spent more time smoothing her coat and thanking staff in polished tones than looking directly at the bed. She spoke about routines, specialists, and how important it was to stay strong, as if neat sentences could make the room less frightening. Amara said little. She moved straight to her father's side. The doctors had already told her he could not respond. She signed to him anyway. Her hands moved with care, not rushed, not dramatic, just honest. She told him school was harder now because people kept mistaking deafness for distance. She told him some teachers spoke too slowly, as if silence had made her small. She told him she missed the way he practiced with her at the kitchen table, patient even when his fingers tangled the signs. Then she signed the part that made her mouth tremble. "I miss how hard you tried." From the hallway, Elijah paused with his cart and saw the whole exchange through the narrow glass panel. He could not hear her words, but he knew the shape of that kind of speaking. The man in the bed looked still, yet the stillness felt full of weather. When Amara finally stepped back, her eyes caught the little drawing on the windowsill, bent at one corner. She reached out and straightened it carefully before leaving. She never met Lena that day. Still, their connection had already begun. Dr. Victor Dane understood that power moved fastest when dressed as necessity. 3 days after Isaiah's condition was described publicly as grave but stable, Victor called a special board session and entered the room with the expression of a reluctant man doing difficult work for the good of others. He spoke first of tragedy, of uncertainty, of the burden of leadership in painful times. Every sentence was polished to sound lawful, measured, humane. Then he introduced the real purpose of the meeting. The company, he said, needed temporary operational control while Isaiah remained unable to communicate. It would be clean on paper, narrow in scope, fully reversible if recovery came. Some members hesitated, but Victor had prepared for that too. He had legal memos, emergency language, contingency charts. He made ambition look responsible. What he did not say in the room, but began doing outside it, mattered more. Behind closed doors, Victor started pushing restructuring moves Isaiah would never have approved. Hiring freezes, quiet pressure on division heads, early plans to weaken worker protections and position smaller departments for sale, nothing loud enough to trigger revolt. Just enough to change the company's temperature. When senior staff questioned the speed of it, they were thanked for their loyalty and reminded that difficult seasons required unity. Concern was recast as emotional strain. Resistance became impracticality. The company Isaiah had built on trust did not collapse overnight. It simply began to feel colder. And for the people who knew its soul, that change was more frightening than any headline. Adrienne chose the far end of the hospital corridor for private conversations. The stretch near the darkened family lounge, where voices could drop low and still carry just enough through an open door. She met Victor there twice in 1 week, each time dressed in concern, each time speaking as though she were protecting what Isaiah built rather than circling what he might lose. They used words like stability and transition, but beneath them lived inheritance, guardianship, and image. Adrienne spoke first about the press, about how important it was to control public sympathy before rumours began shaping the story. Victor answered with careful confidence, assuring her the board was handling operational matters. Then her voice shifted, lower and colder. Amara complicates things, she said. She needs structure, specialized care. Somewhere quiet, somewhere prepared. Victor understood immediately. Away from the city. A boarding program, Adrienne replied. A good one. It will look responsible. It would also remove Isaiah's daughter from the centre of decisions that should have belonged to her father. Inside the room, Isaiah listened in horror. They were not only trying to inherit his absence, they were planning to rearrange his daughter's life while he lay trapped feet away, unable to say her name. Company. Home. Child. Everything that mattered was being translated into paperwork by people who mistook silence for surrender. For the first time since the accident, panic sharpened instead of drowning him. He did not just want to come back. He had to, before signatures dried, before headlines settled, before power hardened around his stillness and called it fate. Nurse Carmen Ruiz had worked long enough in private care to know that wealth changed the shape of a hospital room, but it should never change the ethics inside it. She was competent, precise, and not easily impressed by famous names. What unsettled her about Isaiah Cole's case was not his status, it was the paperwork. Twice in 1 week, she saw requests for sedation adjustments that did not match the pattern of his chart or the best practice expected for a patient in fragile neurological recovery. The orders were signed cleanly enough, yet the approval trail bent through administrators and outside representatives with no clear medical reason to be there. Too many of them stood to benefit if Isaiah remained silent, unresponsive, and easy to manage. Carmen did not rush into suspicion. She had seen enough bad care caused by confusion without adding paranoia to it. Still, she began making quiet notes. Dates. Times. Copies of requests. Small irregularities that meant little alone but did not feel harmless together. She also noticed other things. The janitor, Elijah, always treated Isaiah like a man who might still matter, and whenever certain visitors entered the room, especially the sister and the board member, Isaiah's eyes changed. Not dramatically, just enough to suggest strain, alertness, maybe even fear. For the first time, the silence around Isaiah no longer felt empty. It felt watched after that first night. Lena began stopping at Isaiah's room whenever Elijah's shift and the kindness of time allowed it. Never for long. Just a few minutes here and there, small visits tucked into the late hours when the wind grew quiet and the world seemed willing to loosen its grip. She always stood where he could see her. Then she would begin. Her hands moved through simple stories told in sign and expression, bright with the confidence of a child who had not yet learned to perform doubt for adults. She told him what colour the sky had been when she arrived. She told him what she drew in school that week. She told him which flowers belonged in a real garden, and which ones, in her opinion, were trying too hard. Sometimes Elijah translated softly. Sometimes he did not need to, meaning lived easily in her face. What changed the room was not only what Lena said, it was how she said it. She spoke to Isaiah as if presence did not need proving, as if stillness was not emptiness, as if a person could remain fully there, even when the world had grown impatient with silence. Soon Isaiah began measuring his days by her visits. He held on to them the way a man at sea might hold on to lights along a shore. Before Lena, time had blurred into machines, footsteps, and fear. Now it had shape. The room was still quiet. But it was no longer empty. The effort began the night Isaiah heard Adrienne mention the boarding program again, this time with dates attached to it. Forms were being reviewed. Options were being narrowed. Amara's life was being discussed as if her father were already a framed photograph on a shelf. Something in him refused to stay still after that. He gathered every thought he had and aimed it at one finger on his right hand. Move, he told it. Just once. Not a speech, not a miracle. A twitch. A sign. Anything. He pushed the command through wave after wave of exhaustion until the effort itself felt like lifting stone with his mind. Nothing happened. Not at first. The failure shook him more than he expected. Panic rose hot in his chest, followed by the terrible fear that awareness might be all he had left, a witness with no way to warn anyone before his daughter was carried out of reach. When Elijah entered later, he stopped almost immediately. Easy, he said softly, stepping closer. I can see you're trying. Isaiah could not answer, but he fixed all of himself on the sound of that voice. Elijah stood where he could be seen and signed as he spoke. You are not alone. Carmen noticed it too the next morning. The strain in Isaiah's face did not look random. It looked directed, as if effort was collecting somewhere beneath the surface, and failing only at the final distance. For the first time, communication no longer felt like a desperate fantasy. It felt like a question no one had tested carefully enough. Lena was holding a new drawing when it happened. It was the same garden as before, only brighter now, with a tall sunflower near the centre, and a blue path curling toward a bench. She stood by Isaiah's bed and lifted the page so he could see it clearly, then began signing her explanation with full concentration. The sunflower, she told him, was there because gardens should have at least one thing brave in them. As her small hand moved across the paper, she suddenly stopped. Her eyes dropped to Isaiah's right hand. Children who live inside silence learn early that the world speaks in tiny changes. A shoulder tightens, a face shifts, a breath catches. They notice what louder people miss. Lena stepped closer, staring at his finger. Then she turned to Elijah with complete certainty and signed he moved on purpose. Elijah looked from his daughter to the bed, hesitation crossing his face. Hope was dangerous when a room had already taught you disappointment. Still, he set down his cart, moved into Isaiah's line of sight, and signed a simple question. Can you hear me? Isaiah reached with everything he had, trying to find that same path again, trying to command one finger into one small answer. Nothing came. Not this time. Not yet. But Elijah did not dismiss Lena. He stayed, and in that room, where doubt had ruled so long, something had shifted beyond proof. Belief had entered first. The recommendation appeared in the chart with the clean language powerful people preferred. Continued care. Specialized supervision. Long-term neurological management. On paper, the distant facility looked respectable. In whispered staff talk, it was known for something else: privacy, control, and the kind of discretion families chose when they wanted difficult cases kept quiet. Victor and Adrienne presented the transfer as mercy. They spoke of efficiency, stability, and the need to place Isaiah somewhere designed for prolonged recovery. Adrienne added the right touches of sorrow. Victor wore the grave expression of a man making painful but sensible decisions. Together they made removal sound compassionate. Carmen did not like the timing. She stood at the nurse's station, reviewing the paperwork twice, then a third time, feeling the unease sharpen. The transfer request had arrived too quickly after the strange sedation adjustments, and the approvals leaned again through channels that felt administrative rather than medical. Nothing was openly false. That was what made it dangerous. Everything had been arranged to look reasonable. Elijah overheard enough while emptying bins near the corridor to understand this was not ordinary planning. He caught the names, the facility, the urgency in Victor's low voice. No one moved that fast for healing. Inside the room, Isaiah heard one word that swallowed all others. Transfer. Terror moved through him with a force greater than pain. A new hospital meant new staff, new walls, fewer eyes that knew him, and distance between him and Amara that power could easily make permanent. Since waking inside silence, he had feared many things. This was the first fear that felt like erasure. Amara arrived earlier than expected, brought by a driver after Aunt Rochelle was delayed across town. She stepped off the elevator with her backpack still on one shoulder, tired from school but determined, and moved down the hall with the practiced focus of someone who had learned that adults often mistook neatness for care. Near her father's room, she stopped. A little girl stood on tiptoe beside the windowsill, carefully pressing tape onto the top corner of a drawing that had slipped crooked. It was Lena. For a second, neither child spoke. Then Lena turned, noticed the way Amara was watching her hands, and signed a quiet hello. Amara blinked in surprise before signing back. The exchange was simple at first. Names. Age. Whether the drawing belonged to her. Lena nodded and signed that it was for the man in the room, because gardens made lonely places feel less lonely. Amara's expression softened. She looked through the glass at her father, then back at Lena. Lena hesitated only once before signing what she had clearly been holding inside for days. I think he is still in there. Amara froze. It was the sentence she had been afraid to hope for, the one she had carried like a secret ember every time people spoke around her father instead of to him. Her throat tightened. She looked again through the glass, seeing not only the bed and the monitors, but possibility. Together, the girls stood there in the quiet hallway, looking at Isaiah not as a patient already fading from the world, but as a father waiting to be reached. Section 6.3. Carmen makes a choice. Carmen had spent enough years in hospitals to know the danger of acting on instinct alone. Lives could be damaged by assumptions as easily as by neglect, but by the end of that week, instinct was no longer all she had. The pattern had become too clear. She stayed late after shift change, reviewing Isaiah's chart in the blue light of the nurse's station while the floor settled into evening rhythm. The sedation notes did not line up with the progress checks. The transfer order had been accelerated without a medical turn that justified urgency. One approval routed through legal counsel connected to the family. Another touched a consultant retained by the board. Each piece on its own could be explained. Together they felt like a hand slowly closing. Carmen printed copies she was not sure she should be making and slid them into a plain folder. Later, in the supply room where no one had reason to linger, she told Elijah what she had found. She kept her voice low, careful even with him. This is beyond planning, she said. Someone benefits from him staying exactly as he is. Elijah listened without interrupting. The fatigue in his face deepened, but not with surprise, more with confirmation. He told her what he had overheard about the transfer, about the facility chosen for discretion rather than real recovery. Then he told her about the way Isaiah's face changed when certain names entered the room. Carmen looked toward the hall. If they move him now, she said, whatever chance he has may disappear before anyone asks the right questions. For the first time, their worry became shared purpose. They still did not know how to stop what was coming, but the silence around it had broken. Elijah waited until after midnight, when the hallway emptied and the private wing softened into low light and machine hum. He checked once through the glass, then stepped into Isaiah's room and closed the door with quiet care. On the windowsill, the garden drawing leaned beside a new sunflower Lena had made with a face too bright for the hour. Elijah came to the bedside and stood where Isaiah could see him clearly. "I'm going to try something," he said. He signed as he spoke, slow and deliberate, making each motion as clear as possible. Isaiah fixed all of himself on those hands. One movement for yes, no movement for no. Don't force more than you can. Isaiah felt fear first, not because he doubted Elijah, but because hope had become dangerous. Still, he gathered himself and listened. "Can you hear me?" The question opened a space so large it seemed to swallow the room. Isaiah pushed everything he had toward that same finger, the right one, the one he had been trying to wake like a buried match. Pain flared in his arm. Exhaustion blurred the edges of the ceiling. Move. For one terrible moment, nothing happened. Then the finger twitched. It was tiny, almost nothing. A shift most people would have missed if they were not waiting for it. Elijah saw it. His face broke before he could stop it, shock and relief flashing together so fast it looked like grief trying to become joy. He swallowed hard, steadied himself with visible effort, and asked the next question. "Is someone hurting you?" Isaiah dragged his focus back through the darkness gathering behind his eyes. Again, the finger moved. Yes. The room went still around the truth. No monitor sounded. No dramatic sound marked the moment, yet everything had changed. At last, silence had a witness. Elijah did not leave the room for several minutes after the second signal. He stood with one hand over his mouth, breathing through the shock, then bent close enough for Isaiah to see the tears he was trying not to let fall. "I hear you," he whispered. "I hear you." By morning, Carmen was there, and before noon she had found a reason to bring Amara in during a quieter stretch, away from Adrienne's scheduling and the board's watchful calls. Lena came too, holding Elijah's hand until they reached the door. Inside, the room felt different now, as if truth had altered the air. Elijah explained the test first to Carmen, then to Amara, keeping his voice low and measured so hope would not outrun caution. Carmen repeated the question herself, watching not only the hand, but the whole body, the focus in Isaiah's face, the strain that gathered before effort. "Can you hear me, Mr. Cole?" The finger moved. Amara's breath caught sharply. Her hands trembled so hard she had to press them together before she could sign. She stepped to the bedside, eyes filling before the first word formed. "Dad, do you know I'm here?" Isaiah looked at her with all the force he had left and moved his finger again. "Yes." Amara broke then, not into noise, but into the kind of crying that comes from having been careful too long. She pressed one hand lightly against the blanket near his arm and signed through tears, half laughing, half shaking. "I knew it. I knew you were trying." Lena stood beside the window, solemn and wide-eyed. Then, with a gentleness that made the moment even more tender, she placed her sunflower next to the garden drawing. The windowsill became a small altar of belief. The first relief passed quickly. In its place came a quieter, more dangerous understanding. Carmen was the one who said it aloud. If Victor or Adrienne learn he can communicate, even this little, they will move faster. No one in the room disagreed. The blinds were half open, letting in a pale wash of afternoon light. Isaiah lay exhausted from the effort of answering, but his eyes stayed alert, moving from face to face as the people who had become his allies began deciding what to do with the truth. He had once led boardrooms full of polished executives, yet the most important strategy of his life now gathered around a hospital bed with a nurse, a janitor, and 2 girls who believed in what others had missed. They agreed on caution. Until the records were secured and the transfer blocked, they would keep the breakthrough small and private. Elijah would continue visiting as usual. Carmen would keep documenting everything. Amara would speak to her father only when the room was safe, hiding hope behind the same quiet patience she had been forced to learn since the accident. Even Lena understood enough to nod when Elijah told her this part was secret, because some grown-ups did not deserve truth before they had earned it. Elijah felt the weight of it most sharply. He did not belong in legal battles or corporate schemes. He cleaned floors. He stretched paychecks. He carried his daughter home asleep on his shoulder. But Amara trusted him, Carmen relied on him, and Isaiah's eyes followed him with a kind of steady gratitude that made retreat impossible. For the first time since the crash, Isaiah felt more than awareness. He felt agency beginning to return, not through power, but through people choosing courage around his silence. Because no one suspected the truth, Victor and Adrienne kept speaking near Isaiah with the careless confidence of people who believed the room belonged only to them. Their voices lowered when staff came and rose again once the door shut, never fully whispering, because whispering still implies respect for a witness. Victor came first, his shoes making hard sounds against the polished floor. He stood by the window scanning his phone while Adrienne adjusted flowers from a sender who wanted to be seen caring. The performance lasted less than a minute. The proxies will hold if legal keeps this framed as a temporary incapacity, Victor said. Adrienne answered without looking at Isaiah. Then it needs to stay temporary in wording only. The market hates uncertainty more than tragedy. They moved easily from the company to the house, from the house to Amara, from Amara to media timing. Adrienne worried that the girl's attachment to routine might make a boarding placement look sudden. Victor said that with the right specialist recommendation, the move could be sold as protective rather than strategic. He spoke of her childhood as a narrative problem to manage. Isaiah listened and memorized. Then the conversation darkened further. Victor, thinking himself clever rather than criminal, remarked that it was fortunate the accident review had remained focused on weather and impact speed instead of chasing emotional theories from employees who thought the board had motive. He said it lightly, almost laughing, but the meaning beneath it turned cold in Isaiah's mind. Maybe Victor had not caused the crash. Maybe he had simply made sure questions died before they found fertile ground. Silence, once a prison, became a ledger. Isaiah could not write a word of it down, but he stored every sentence with the fierce clarity of a man who knew one day he would need to speak for the part of himself others had tried to erase that night, after the room emptied and the machines resumed their endless small conversations. Isaiah drifted inward the way he often did when the outer world became too cruel to hold all at once. He returned again to Naomi, not to the bright early years this time, but to the hospice room where love had been stripped down to its most honest shape. He remembered the sound of her breathing when sleep would not fully take her. He remembered lifting ice chips to her lips, adjusting blankets, reading paragraphs twice because pain had pulled her attention away the first time. He remembered how small the tasks had looked from the outside and how enormous they had felt inside. None of it fixed what was happening. All of it mattered. Then he had thought he was the strong one. Now he understood that Naomi had carried another kind of strength entirely, the strength of remaining open while helpless, of receiving care without mistaking dependence for shame. She had let herself be seen in pain and still found ways to love through it. He had admired that. Only now did he begin to understand its cost. The memory did not make his own suffering lighter, it made it clearer. He saw, too, what grief had nearly turned him into before the accident, efficient, dutiful, more closed than he admitted. Not unloving, just guarded. Naomi had feared exactly that, and even now, from memory, she seemed to ask him the same thing she had asked from the bed where she was fading. Stay open. Isaiah lay in the darkness and made a private vow. If he survived this, he would not spend the rest of his life merely reclaiming power. He would build something gentler with whatever was left to him. Carmen waited 2 more days before showing Elijah the full extent of what she had gathered. She chose the staff break room at the end of a slow shift when the vending machine hummed louder than conversation and no one important had reason to pass through. From her bag she pulled a folder thickened by copies and a small phone wrapped in a plain cloth. The paperwork stops the transfer if the right people care enough, she said. This may make them care. She played the clip. The audio was not perfect. A cart had squeaked past at one point, and a distant intercom bled into the edges, but Victor's voice came through clearly enough. He was speaking to a physician in the corridor, his tone low, impatient, practiced. Recovery expectations need to remain realistic, he said. Business stability depends on avoiding false hope. The physician answered cautiously, resisting without directly refusing. Victor pressed again, not ordering anything outright, but making his meaning plain. He wanted sedation handled in ways that kept Isaiah quiet, manageable, predictable. Nothing illegal stated cleanly, just pressure applied where ambiguity could do damage. Elijah listened with his jaw tight. That stops being concern, he said. Carmen nodded. and starts becoming motive. The recording alone could not prove every wrongdoing, neither could the paperwork, but together they formed enough of a pattern to halt the transfer and invite scrutiny from people Victor would not control easily. Elijah looked toward the hall, thinking beyond the hospital. He still has legal counsel, he said, not board lawyers. His own Carmen had considered the same thing. Isaiah's long-time attorney had been sidelined, not dismissed, because everyone assumed he no longer mattered while Isaiah lay silent. That assumption, like so many others, could become useful. They built the plan carefully, secure the records, contact counsel quietly, protect Amara, block the transfer first, then expose the pressure behind it. It was not dramatic. It was better than dramatic. It was solid. Transfer morning arrived, wrapped in false calm. The sun had barely risen when the first paperwork was wheeled in on a clipboard, followed by a transport team trying to sound ordinary. Orderlies checked straps and rails with a detached efficiency of men told this was routine. At the nurse's station, Carmen's voice stayed level as she asked for signatures to be re-verified, then rechecked again. Every delay bought minutes, and minutes had become precious. Adrienne appeared in a tailored coat and grief arranged neatly across her face. She thanked staff too warmly, as if generosity could soften what she was there to do. Victor came a few minutes later, which confirmed everything. A board member had no reason to supervise medical transport unless he feared something might change before the wheels moved. Elijah stood farther down the hall, with Lena, pretending to clean a brass railing that did not need cleaning. Amara had arrived early and stayed near the family lounge, hidden from the center of the commotion, because Carmen did not want her caught in whatever happened next. The girls sat together in tense silence, hands clasped, waiting. Inside the room, Isaiah felt time narrowing. Voices blurred at the edges, but one fact remained sharp. If the bed crossed that threshold, the fragile world of witnesses and evidence around him might scatter. He had to do more than move a finger now. He had to break through the stone his body had become. As the orderlies released the bed breaks and reached for the frame, Isaiah drew everything inward, every memory, every promise, every fear for Amara, every word he had heard and stored. The effort was unbearable. Still, he gathered it. The bed moved 6 inches before Isaiah found the sound. It did not come cleanly. It rose rough and scraped raw, as if dragged through a body that had forgotten how speech worked. One of the orderlies paused, thinking perhaps a machine had shifted. Then the sound came again, unmistakably human. Amara. The hallway froze. Adrienne turned first, all colour leaving her face at once. Victor stepped back from the foot of the bed with a look so nakedly startled that for a moment he seemed stripped of every polished defence he had ever worn. Carmen moved closer, not in surprise alone, but in readiness. Elijah stood motionless in the doorway, his hand still on the rail of the cleaning cart. Amara was already running. She crossed the room as Isaiah fought for one more burst of strength. The words were slow, fractured by effort, but each one landed harder because of how much it cost. "I heard you." He stopped, breath catching, throat burning. Then he forced the rest through. Everything. No one moved. The sentence settled over the room like judgment. Amara reached the bedside, crying openly now, her hands flying into signs so fast they blurred. "Dad, I'm here. I'm here." Isaiah turned his eyes toward her, and though his body gave him little else, that turn held more love than full speech ever had. Victor recovered first, trying to say something about confusion, about isolated response, about the stress of movement, but his voice had lost its center. Adrienne opened her mouth and closed it again. Elijah looked at Isaiah with wonder and pain mixed together. A man once buried in silence had chosen his first real words not for status, not for money, not for revenge, for his daughter. And for the truth, once the shock broke, the room moved quickly. Carmen had been ready for this possibility, though not for its exact shape. While Adrienne stumbled through breathless explanations and Victor began reaching for procedural language like a shield, Carmen stepped into the hallway and called hospital administration directly. Then she called the attorney, whose number she had kept folded in her pocket for 2 days. By the time security arrived, so did Isaiah's legal counsel Harold Green, grey-haired and sharp-eyed, carrying 20 years of loyalty with none of the board's appetite for theatre. Carmen handed over the copied records first, then the audio clip. Harold listened once, expression hardening by degrees, and asked only one question before taking the matter from possibility into record. Can Mr. Cole identify these voices? Isaiah could not give a full statement yet, but when Harold named Victor and Adrian, the answer came through the smallest nod his body could manage and the faintest movement of that stubborn finger. It was enough. The transfer was halted immediately. Victor tried to reclaim the room with indignation, insisting the board had acted from concern, that his words were being taken out of context, that emergency leadership required difficult decisions. But confidence had drained from him. For the first time, he looked like what he was, a man who had spoken too freely in front of someone he thought could never answer. Adrienne folded faster. She cried, then denied, then claimed she had only wanted what was best for Amara. The lie sat thinly in the air. Isaiah lay exhausted, speech gone again for the moment, but no longer erased. He did not need many words now. Others had finally begun hearing what silence had been holding all along. The company shifted before Isaiah ever returned to it. News did not break to the public all at once, but inside the executive floors the effect was immediate. Word spread that Isaiah Cole had regained limited communication, that a transfer had been blocked under disturbing circumstances, and that outside counsel was reviewing actions taken during his incapacity. The mood Victor had cultivated, controlled, strategic, inevitable, began collapsing under its own haste. Board members who had nodded along in private meetings suddenly rediscovered caution. Some requested independent review. Others claimed they had understood all emergency powers to be temporary and narrow. The same men and women who had accepted cold necessity now spoke at length about governance, transparency, and fiduciary duty. Fear had turned them principled. Operational changes were frozen first. The worker protections Victor had targeted were restored pending review. Proposed sales of smaller divisions were suspended. Department heads who had felt pressure to stay quiet began sending documented concerns to Harold Green's office, and once one person spoke, others followed. A company that had seemed to go numb under Isaiah's silence started feeling again. Isaiah remained in recovery, too weak to return, too limited to command in the old way, yet his values re-entered the boardroom before his body ever did. Staff remembered what he had built and recognized how quickly it had chilled without him. That memory became its own form of evidence. Victor had wanted a silent company, one easy to redirect while its founder lay unreachable. Instead, his haste exposed him. And in the empty space where his certainty had stood, truth began reorganizing the room. The family reckoning came quieter than the corporate one, but it cut deeper. Adrienne lost access first. Harold petitioned successfully to suspend every attempt she had made to position herself near Isaiah's affairs, and once financial records were pulled into review, the pattern of her interest became harder to disguise. Nothing so dramatic as theft had occurred. She had been too careful for that. But the timing of documents, the calls about guardianship, the private discussions around the house and company property all revealed the same ugly truth. She had not waited for Isaiah to die. She had begun practicing for his absence. Marcus unravelled faster. Without Victor's confidence behind him and his mother's certainty to borrow, he became what he had always been, a man flattered by proximity to power and too weak to resist its promises. In a meeting Harold arranged, Marcus admitted enough to wound everyone present. He said his mother had convinced him this was how difficult families protected legacy. He said he knew parts of it felt wrong. He said he liked the idea of access anyway. When Isaiah finally faced them both, it happened in a rehabilitation suite, not a courtroom. He sat in a chair by the window, speaking only in short phrases, using signs when speech failed. The effort of every sentence showed in his body. That made his disappointment heavier. I needed family, he said slowly. You measured rooms. Adrienne cried then, not elegantly, but Isaiah did not soften. He did not rage either. That would have been easier for her to survive. Instead, He looked at his sister with the steady sorrow of a man who had expected blood to mean refuge and found appetite instead. He would not let family become an excuse where truth required consequence. The legal briefing took place in a small conference room near rehabilitation, far from the grand spaces Isaiah once occupied when decisions carried market value. This room held a plain wood table, uneven coffee, and 4 people who had no reason to be there except that conscience had brought them. Elijah came in wearing his hospital work shoes and a clean shirt that still looked apologetic beside polished furniture. Lena sat next to him, swinging her feet a little, trying to stay solemn because she sensed the hour mattered. Carmen stood near the window with a folder in hand. Amara took the seat nearest her father before anyone else could. Isaiah spoke slowly, choosing each word with effort. When speech tired him, he signed, and Amara or Elijah helped when his fingers faltered. No one in the room rushed him. That patience itself felt like part of the healing. He thanked Carmen first. "You protected truth," he said, voice rough but steady. Then Elijah. Isaiah looked at him for a long moment before continuing. "You treated me like I was still here." Elijah lowered his eyes, moved beyond language for a moment. He had been thanked before in life, mostly for labor no one wanted to notice. This was different. This was not gratitude tossed downward. It was recognition given across. Isaiah turned to Lena and managed the smallest smile. First person who believed. Lena grinned so brightly that the room warmed around it. Last he faced Amara. His hands shook as he signed, but the message reached her clear enough. "Your voice found me." Amara leaned into him then, crying softly against his shoulder. In that ordinary room, without cameras or applause, Isaiah named the people who had held the line when power failed him. The most formerly powerless had protected his life, his daughter, and the soul of what he had built. Recovery did not arrive like victory. It arrived like work. Some mornings Isaiah could lift a cup without help and considered that enough to carry him through the day. Other mornings his own body felt borrowed and uncooperative, a house rearranged while he slept. The therapists were kind but unsentimental. They measured gains in inches, seconds, repetitions. Wealth changed the room around the effort, not the effort itself. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, Isaiah could not solve progress by force. That humbled him. Amara became part of his rehabilitation, almost without anyone formally deciding it. She came after school with homework in her bag and determination in her posture, ready to practice signs, encourage stubborn muscles, and laugh when her father got frustrated enough to glare at his own hands. Sometimes he missed a motion and she corrected him with mock seriousness. Sometimes he signed too fast and she reminded him that clarity mattered more than pride. The work made them closer than polished family life ever had. Before the accident, love had often been squeezed between meetings, grief, and the pressure to remain composed. Now they sat in honest time together. No performance, no pretending energy they did not have. Just effort, patience, and the return of trust through repeated small things. When exhaustion hit, Elijah's phrase returned like a thread running through the story of them all. "You are not alone." Isaiah heard it from Amara now too, not always in words, sometimes just in the way she stayed. And slowly, without fanfare, his life began opening again. But Isaiah Cole lost power, speech and control, but not awareness. While greedy relatives and a ruthless board tried to erase him, a janitor, a nurse, and 2 brave girls kept seeing the person still inside the silence. A child's belief led to a finger twitch, and that small movement became the beginning of truth. When Isaiah finally spoke, he did not speak for revenge first. He spoke for his daughter and for what he had heard. Justice came, but it came with dignity, not noise. Out of betrayal grew a new purpose shaped by hospice memory, disability access, and ordinary kindness. In the end, the garden from a child's drawing became real, and the man everyone nearly buried in silence learnt that the deepest rescue begins when someone refuses to stop listening.